Good afternoon. The numbers joining are still going up quite quickly, so we'll just leave it for a moment or two to let no more people join. Right, the flow of new joiners it's slowing. So I think we'll start. So good afternoon to all who have joined this call. I'm William MacDonald. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Banker Institute. I'm also an honorary fellow of the CISI. So that's probably why I'm chairing this very important event. Could I first mention that both institutes have LinkedIn groups? And in relation to the Chartered Banker Institute, I would also mention the Edinburgh, Lothians and Fife District Centre LinkedIn group. So if you'd like to join that, please apply. There is also the CISI Scottish Regional LinkedIn group, and I'm sure they would like to have some additional members on that. Recording of the event will be on CISI TV for CISI members, and a copy will be sent to the Chartered Banker Institute, where it will be uploaded onto their YouTube channel. So you've probably read through all the biographical details of our speakers. They were published on the events booking page. So in the interest of getting as much content in as possible into our hour together, I will only mention the highlights. Firstly, I would like to introduce Simon Thompson, who is Chief Executive of the Chartered Banker Institute. He was appointed to that role in 2007 after working for the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants in Central and Eastern Europe. Under his leadership, the Institute has grown to become the largest professional body for bankers in the UK, with nearly 35,000 members and students in more than 100 countries. He is the author of Green and Sustainable Finance, Principles and Practice, and leads the Institute's work in this area. So welcome, Simon. From the CISI, we have George Littlejohn, MCSI. He's a senior advisor there. He is a qualified chartered accountant. He qualified with PwC before becoming a journalist with The Economist, specializing in financial and economic matters. He is senior advisor at the CISI, conducting advisory work in financial centres across Europe, the Middle East and Asia over the past 2 decades. He is a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, and author of a number of works on risk management. And so welcome, George. And finally, we have Elisa Moskalen, who is a board member of the Chartered Banker Institute and Executive Vice President for Sustainability with Sage Group PLC. She's a sustainability professional with a track record of driving this agenda in global blue chip organizations. She advises boards and executive teams on sustainability strategy and execution. She's currently Executive Vice President for Sustainability at Sage, and previously she was Head of Sustainability and ESG at Santander. So welcome, Elisa. We have dropped one of our speakers, or lost one of our speakers, because she's not feeling terribly well, having she's having a sort of a crisis within her family, and therefore isn't able to join us together. So George will have to field both sets of questions for the CISI. So to start us off, I've just mentioned for audience members that you should put your questions in the Q&A function. So to start off, we will ask the panel members what they're working on at present. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks, William. Good afternoon, everybody. So what in particular I'm was working sort of earlier this morning on the updating principles and practice of green and sustainable finance. So sort of rewriting a book. As many of you may know, there's been green and sustainable finance is one of, if not the most rapidly developing area in business and finance at the moment. Just over the past few months, we've had the latest assessments of climate science from the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change, which makes quite stark sort of reading that global surface temperatures are likely to rise under all scenarios now to at least 1.5 degrees and quite probably 2 degrees later in the century, unless we make very, very rapid, dramatic and sustained reductions that would have to start now, which I don't think is likely to happen. I'm sure we'll get onto it later. There's been the launch of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, all of the various other announcements from COP26, so many kind of regulatory and market developments all around the world. And in particular, I guess, an increasing focus on transition finance and many of the broader social and environmental aspects of sustainability, particularly kind of biodiversity or addressing biodiversity loss and understanding the opportunities from nature-based finance. But more broadly, I mean, that's writing a book. But the reason we're writing the book is, and revising the course, is that we want to, and we need to very rapidly build capacity and capability to support the UK's and the world's net zero ambitions. Because if we want to pass the Carney test and ensure that every professional financial decision takes account of climate change, we need to make sure that every banking and finance professional develops a relevant knowledge and understanding in this area and aligns their professional practice with sustainability. So the other two things in particular I'm working on in this area is as the chair of the UK's Green Finance Education Charter, which brings together 14 professional bodies, including the Chartered Banker Institute and CISI, and George in person is part of that. And also, I'm a member of the Scottish Government's Green and Sustainable Finance Task Force, which was launched back in February by Mark Carney, and that's also going to have quite a focus on capacity and capability building in Scotland. But now, for me, William, let's hear what some of the others have been up to.
Right, over to George. What are you working on just now?
Thank you, William, and thank you very much. I feel very honoured to be invited onto this otherwise very distinguished panel. We were talking just before we came on air about the volume of jargon in this market, the use of words like sustainability and unique and innovative and significant and so on and so forth. We've all heard far too many of them, but I guess the one bit of jargon I've been working on of late is integration. Simon mentioned Mark Carney's great mantra, which has helped the Green Finance Education Charter under Simon achieve huge results, actually, is about every financial decision being made with climate in mind. There's sometimes a tendency for people to think that ESG or green or sustainable should be something separate, something of the other on the side. And I think part of my campaigning right now is to make sure that people understand that thinking along these lines must be informed with the sort of skills and knowledge which can integrate these concepts into everything that we do. I get terribly excited being, as you said, an accountant about some of the work being done by one of the acronyms, ISSB, which we'll come back to later, the International Sustainability Standards Board. I think I'm sort of guided in this by Alexander Pope, the English poet of 3 centuries ago. He's dead now, I'm sad to say, but he came up with many great aphorisms, one of which was a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, which in this market, I think it is. There is a certain tendency of people to think that, yeah, read one pamphlet on green finance, or you do one 1-hour talk on it and you know everything there is to talk about it. That's potentially dangerous, I think. But Pope did say a bit after that, that we were all amateurs once, all experts were amateurs once. And I think one of the great things that people like Chartered Banker Institute, CISI, and other professional bodies have done is to encourage people to understand that you can actually become an expert fairly rapidly. Kate Capocci, who sadly, as you said, can't join us today, is just turned 30, but she is already a chartered fellow of our institute, a chartered banker, and she has done a number of our exams and exudes knowledge and brain power in this area. And I hope you're not hoping that I will match her standards in this call on behalf of CISI. So I think integration is the one key thing just now. And we're also planning a large series of events over the summer and into the autumn covering these areas, and also how to communicate with them. I've just been on a recording with a really brilliant communicator with some very simple rules about how to communicate what we're trying to do properly. I think greenwashing is going to be a big subject of this year, and dynamic materiality in accounting and reporting matters. Communicating these is going to be one of the big challenges of the autumn, I think. And thank you.
Thanks, George. And now, Elisa, what are you working on? Because you've only recently gone to Sage.
That's correct. Now we'll build on George's point. One of the things I'm working on, and I'm always working on, is integrating sustainability in the business. I think you're very right, George. Sustainability is not something that you do on the side of your desk or on top of the business. And I would like one day to stop talking about a sustainability strategy and start talking about sustainable business strategy. So not seeing a separate sustainability strategy, but actually all businesses to think about their business models through the lenses of sustainability itself. And that, means doing a lot of things. So it's a simple word, integration, but what it really takes is having the right team, the right skills and expertise in the right place. It takes upskilling, because the reality is that sustainability hardly ever gets done by a small central team, but it's something that, you need to really take the company through the journey with you. I'm working on the strategy at Sage. Sage is at an early stage of the journey, but it's made leaps. It keeps on making leaps forwards. There's a great appetite and big ambition. So I've joined, as you mentioned, William, just 3 months ago, but we've already made a lot of progress. That was before me, and now with me, I want to raise the bar and take Sage to the next level. And I think there's all the appetite to go there. So one thing is integration. And then I'm doing other 2 things. One is making sure that Sage walks the talk, especially when it comes to our climate commitments. And the third and last one is thinking about how we support our customers to do the same. And these last 2 are very much connected. I'm aware that as a big FTSE 100 company, we have a duty to align to Paris Agreement. And I'm currently, as we speak, about to submit our science-based targets. But I'm also conscious that although that's very important, the ICT sector accounts for 1% of emissions. So although it's important when we do our part, I think where our biggest opportunity is to support small, medium businesses onto this transition. And I'm really honored to be here today. And what I hope I can do is bring the view of small, medium businesses around the table. I feel that I've worked in my whole career in a big blue chip organization. I always felt that SMEs were missing from this sustainability dialogue, and they still are, yet they are 90% of the global economy. So I hope I can bring a bit that perspective around the table today.
Thanks very much. Right, let's play the acronym game. So Simon, I think, which is yours? Is it GFANS?
It is, yeah. Well, I think in honor of the event, and it's a Scottish-focused event, albeit online. So hopefully we have members from both our institutes from around the world. I've chosen GFANS, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, chaired by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, now UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. So GFANS brings together some 450 financial institutions from 45 countries, sort of responsible for assets in excess of $130 trillion, which of course, if actually all of those assets were deployed to tackle the climate crisis, would have all the funds we need to be able to do that. Of course, the issue is they're not, and so that's what GFANS is trying to do, to try to make sure that lenders and investors decarbonize portfolios and to invest in climate, environmental positive activities. So GFANS brings together a number of other sort of net zero alliances that have formed over the years, including the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. The list kind of goes on and on and on like this. And in brief, the GFANS members have to use science-based guidelines to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And that has to cover all emissions scope. So it's not just the direct emissions, but financed emissions through lending and investment portfolios. But in particular as well, they have to set really quite very challenging, I think, for many institutions, 2030 interim targets and then 5-year targets sort of after that, in line with the United Nations Race to Zero criteria. And without a lot of capacity and capability building, plus a lot of other things, I think a lot of these targets are going to be very difficult for institutions to achieve. One other thing to note about GFANZ, launched as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, Glasgow because that's where COP26 was last November. There have been global efforts to push Glasgow off and make the G stand for the Global Financial Alliance. But I'm pleased to be able to tell colleagues that due to some very effective lobbying by the Scottish financial services community, the Scottish government and the UK government, the G in GFANZ is staying as Glasgow.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Now moving to Elisa, what's your acronym?
Yeah, so I've chosen science-based targets as I'm working on that, and I think it's something very important in the context also of greenwashing that George just briefly touched upon. So the Science-Based Target Initiative provides clearly defined pathways for companies and financial institutions as well to reduce greenhouse gases emission, aligned to what is considered to be the latest science, climate science. I think that's very important because companies were setting targets, and ultimately the question is that those targets need to answer is whether they're helping on or not to achieve a 1.5 or below degrees world. And if they're not, they're simply not good enough. So I think it's very important that the work that the Science-Based Target Initiative is doing, just to demystify some of the, because it is a complex area, but what the Science-Based Target Initiative does is providing these models that allows company to take their carbon footprint and understand what is the glide path that they need to commit to, what is the target reduction they need to commit to meet the 1.5, to limit warming to 1.5. These targets are near-term targets, which is a 10 years horizon. What's very interesting is that in 2021, the Science-Based Target Initiative has introduced a new standard, which assesses requirements for the long-term reduction, so 2014 and 50. And I think this is a very important initiative, and I believe it brings some rigor around the targets setting. And I'm sure that if there are more questions, we can go into the details, but I'll probably pause here.
Yes, because what I was sort of thinking about there was, if you've got targets which reduce your carbon footprint, is that following the science-based targets, or is a science-based target slightly different?
It's slightly different. So you can have, and for example, at Sage, we have a carbon reduction target. We said we want to commit a 50% reduction of our scope 1, 2, and 3 emission by 2030. Now, because we set that ourselves, that could include also, for example, offsetting. And the methodologies we could use could be very most of the methodologies. I could, for example, decide that I abate only my properties and my scope 1 and 2, and I don't abate scope 3, and that results in my 50%. Now, if you sign up the Science-Based Target Initiative, there are very precise standards and models that you need to use. And there are these science-based, the name is not, it is spot on. There's this science-based climate models that you can play with, and then shows the actual glide path that shows, well, Elisa, you know what, the 50% reduction is not good enough, because even if you do that, you will not achieve a 1.5 degree world. So there is quite a substantial difference. And I think if you stop and look at comparability and the risk of greenwashing, Science-Based Target Initiative is really helping to have a standardized ways of setting targets and fairly common methodologies. Now, the devil is in the details. There are lots of nuances even in there, but it does bring quite a lot of rigor.
Right. Thanks, Elisa. That's
And
great.
William, if I could come in on that, because then there's a strong link there between the point Elisa's made and actually the work of GFANS, which was sort of my acronym, because many financial institutions certainly in sort of the US and many sort of Western countries have made sort of a variety of commitments over the years to net zero or carbon reduction and things like that. But some that chose to follow sort of science-based guidelines, some didn't, and were setting their own versions of that. So one of the things that GFANS is trying to do is to bring order and consistency to this by ensuring that all financial institutions follow the science-based targets, guidelines that relate to financial institutions and so on, which are still, some of them are there, some of them are still emerging and developing, some of them, they only cover some sectors at the moment, but it's to bring that kind of harmonization and consistency so that we can see that the whole we can see how quickly the finance sector is moving towards net zero, the glide path we're on as a whole, and what more still needs to be done.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. George, what's your acronym?
Well, William, I was delighted to hear from Simon that the clandestine efforts to take the G as Glasgow off the front of GFANS have been stopped in their tracks. As someone who comes from near Glasgow, trying to steal something important like that from a Glaswegian is something you'd only try the once.
Don't do that.
I will confess that being an ex-journalist, I'm sometimes a wee bit cynical. And when GFANS was first pre-launched in April, about a year ago, I was somewhat skeptical about what it might achieve, despite my enormous admiration for Mark Carney and those who advise him and so on. And then on the 3rd of November, when it was formally launched with talk of $130 trillion and so on and so forth, as Simon has said, taking one side of these institutions' balance sheets, I did feel initially, and others did too, that this was maybe the most exotic bit of greenwashing we'd ever come across. But in the background, in the detail, there's some wonderful pressure being put. Essentially, what Dr. Carney has done is given politicians around the world and regulators the opportunity to toast the feet of people who are not meeting very simple things that they've signed. A 2-page document in plain English saying that by 2030, as Simon mentioned, they will have met certain targets, and by 2050 build up to others. A key element in this, though, is measurement. As we all know, if you can measure something, you can manage it. And accounting and reporting in this field has been moving in the right direction steadily for some years now, but just in the past 2 years, it's suddenly accelerated. And in particular, with the formal launch, again in beautiful Glasgow at COP26 of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which brought together a huge variety of acronyms and a number of initiatives. But it's an example of the power of professional, if I can quote our friends at the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, the power of one person, in this case, a few people, to do great things because they really believe in them both professionally and personally. Just by way of example, one of these people is a tremendous woman at Deloitte, Veronica Poole, global head of IFRS there, based in London, and vice chair of Assurance. She took her, by then, teenage daughter to the Maldives, I think 4 years ago, to show the corals, which the daughter had only seen as a baby from a boat 10 years beforehand. But when Veronica got there 4 years ago, she discovered that all these beautiful corals had gone. That virtually all had been bleached and irretrievably bleached, and the reason was climate warming. And she then put a significant professional muscle behind helping set up the International Sustainability Standards Board, as I said, launched just 7 months ago, at COP26. And what the ISSB is doing, and I promise not to bore for Britain and Scotland here, but is 2 things, essentially setting up global benchmarks for sustainability reporting. And because of all the work that had been done beforehand by people like TCFD and others, I won't go through the acronyms, there was already an awful lot in place about meeting investor needs, about global comparability of information, and about the importance of high quality information to investors to understand what the value of a company really is. There's also a tremendous building block approach, which is essentially what the standards which the ISSB is developing, and it published its first 2 exposure drafts on the general position and on the climate risks and opportunities in March this year. What they're planning is a system whereby they will build blocks of standards which will enable others to add what they want onto them to achieve the sort of dynamic materiality, which is a buzz phrase which I will use during this program, if you don't mind, which is essentially accounting speak for everything keeps changing and everything keeps changing far too fast. One of the challenges which anyone in any profession faces is that almost daily and certainly monthly, the demands from their clients and from their employers are changing in this field. There's new information. We've just seen, as Simon said, in the past few days, some increasingly terrifying information from the UN about the science issues around this. So financial reporting from my acronym, ISSB, a very important development in terms of helping GFANs meet those standards and also actually helping support some of the work, for instance, the excellent, superb work that Sage is doing with SMEs in terms of helping them meet their emissions reporting standards and properly declare themselves to be net zero businesses.
Thanks,
If I
George.
may, William,
Yeah.
add to Georgia, to the soup of acronyms, I was very glad, Georgia, and I don't know what your view is, that also GRI had joined this effort. One of my big concerns was that such an important standard. So GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative, to which, to be honest, lots of companies either are inspired or adhere to when they create their non-financial disclosures. I was really worried that it wasn't part of that group, and I was very glad to hear in the past few weeks their announcement of, joining that effort.
Yep, that's good. George, just can I come back to you on dynamic materiality? Now I think we're all familiar with the concept of materiality in accounts. And dynamic is where things keep on changing. So how do the two come together in terms of accounting standards?
Can I chip in another materiality matter here, which is double materiality, which is again very important to ISSB, GRI, and all the others. Double materiality, very straightforward, really, that when you present a bit of sustainable reporting, it can be there for two purposes. It can be there to help investors address the value of a business, which is hugely helpful, but it can be there to help others, regulators or investors, individual investors, or customers or employees of a business decide how good their company is, in inverted commas, in terms of meeting the climate challenge. Dynamic materiality, very important because it addresses the fact that in different industries, things move in different ways. Now, until yesterday, when I met some of the people that Sage is working with in this area, I could have spoken about the differences between the challenges facing oil and gas, facing banking, facing transport, and so on. But just yesterday, we were talking about, for instance, the differences between, and I'll let Lisa talk about this because she knows far more about it than I do, but the difference between, let's say, the reporting by pubs and restaurants on how they're achieving their objectives and reporting by hairdressers, and both of which a commercial business called Net Zero Now is working, whereby they're helping SMEs develop proper reporting standards on the sorts of things that really matter to them. So for instance, in a pub, defining scope 3 emissions, which are essentially the results of what you do in very crude terms, relatively straightforward to measure the impact of what the food processes you're using, the drinks processes and so on are doing to the environment and how to measure them. Relatively straightforward, as long as you've got some industry protocols which are agreed. In hairdressing, I understand this group is working with L'Oreal to look at the impact of, for instance, the use of aerosols or more effective methods in hairdressing. So small scale individual businesses, but with major businesses supplying them, how do those supply chain works and what really matters? One of the big problems in financial reporting over the recent years has been not quite clash, but the different way in which the American Financial Accounting Standards Board has gone. But they've worked on a very industry-specific basis in most cases, which is actually now being adopted by ISSB because it's much easier to look at things rather than from a macro level in many cases about what matters in terms of climate and biodiversity, but rather to look at industry verticals. And for instance, in this matter of net zero now, the industry vertical, let's say Le Gavroche in the West End and the Dog and Duck, the pub round the corner from Oliver's, The actual dynamics of that in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are pretty similar indeed. They're not necessarily properly understood by the managers of either place, nothing wrong with that, but they can be helped to do that by professionals in the business. So dynamic materiality matters because things will change and keep changing over the years. And the point is not to get locked into standards which can be out of date in a few weeks' time, or certainly in a few years' time.
If I may add to George's point, from the perspective of, I have done lots of materiality metrics assessments in my career, as you can imagine. And I think that the caveats that I'd add, or the comments that I'd add, is that they all work very well, these concepts in the theory, right? So I think that it's fantastic we're finally looking at double materiality. I always felt that it's important to look at what is the impact that the company has on the environment, on the topics that are material, but we also need to understand and possibly quantify the impacts that these topics will have to the company. And I've seen that since we started, especially in the climate space, to quantify the impacts of such issues on the bottom line is where I started to get really traction from the board and the executive teams. Because ultimately that's the language that businesses understand. So I think that in practical terms, that's what, when you bring it down when you bring down this concept to reality, that's where it becomes helpful. Where the devil is in the details, however, because I think whereas we've made fairly good progress, I'd say, in the models that quantify the financial impacts on climate, the S and the G of ESG are still a quite green space. I think we've got some more work to do to improve the methodologies, because we have to remember one of the acronyms here is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And the social and governance aspects, also for the financial services sector, are incredibly important. And then one last point I'd add, George, on the materiality and dynamic materiality is that, in my experience of doing leading sustainability, creating and leading sustainability strategy and execution, is that you need to reach a balance between dynamic and static. And what I mean by that, a solid sustainability strategy doesn't take 1 year to deliver. And it's not about trends. It's not about this year, what's fashionable is biodiversity. So everyone go and does something, a project on biodiversity. Next year, everyone's forgotten. So let's go off and do something about Black Lives Matters, because this is what makes the headlines. So in my experience, I've seen a misinterpretation of dynamic to almost a reactiveness of this is what the trend is, and therefore we will shift our strategy and shift the strategy onto this direction depending on what makes the headline. This is not what dynamic materiality is. And I think this is an important distinction to make, because in my profession I come across this quite often. And I think if you want to be credible and authentic in delivering sustainability and applying the concept of dynamic materiality, what you really do is you have a solid, robust sustainability strategy that is robustly anchored to your material issues. And I fully agree, George, by your industry and sector determined to certain standards. But then what you do is have a constant horizon scanning to understand what are the other things and where maybe you can put slightly more focus, or you want to raise the bar in terms of the level of ambition. And that's where the dynamisms come into play, as opposed to we forget about one pillar or one area because this is no longer fashionable.
Thanks, Elisa. You wanted to talk about SMEs. You highlighted that at the beginning. Do you want to talk about that at the moment?
Yeah, so I think building on the conversations with just Ed, I think what the way we're thinking about this from a Sage perspective is how can we support SMEs in this journey? And I think there are about 3 angles, right? One is the technology. And this is a question that I cannot answer today. I'll be very open, but I do believe that there is great opportunities in the tech sector to provide solutions to remove friction and make the accounting, the carbon accounting process for SMEs easy. And I think this is something that we really want to work on. The second one is making sure that SMEs have a say. So what we're working on is trying to really test and understand their position and the challenges that SMEs face in implementing sustainability and what is emerging. So we've launched a report last year that titled Start Small, and it really looks at the at how SMEs are approaching sustainability. And what emerged that was very interesting to me is that 83% of SMEs believe that sustainability is incredibly important, which is a very big number if you think about it. Everybody recognizes that this is important, but a good proportion of them also said that other priorities at the moment come first. And I think we can't forget that SMEs are currently recovering from a post-COVID world, going into a recession. So I think that what we really need to do is lobby to make sure that standards are easy to apply, are consistent, but they're not too complicated. We cannot expect, I think, SMEs who have limited time and resources to suddenly turn into climate experts. So I think there is a very important role to play from government regulations, but industry as well, to create, to tailor standards in a way that's digestible, depending on the size of the SMEs. I think that some of the other things that we're learning is, as I said, simplification, but also the link of this agenda to performance. I think that SMEs understand, and there is a clear link. There was a study also done that showed how companies who, including SMEs who had stronger ESG credentials, tend to be more resilient, and also during COVID they perform better. So I think that the key message here, there is a lot of value in delivering on this agenda. More often than not, this is seen as another thing I've got to do in big corporate, but also in SMEs, and especially in an SME world where, you know, your risk officers is also the financial chief officers and IT officers, and probably also your HR and people officers. We need to just be conscious of, you know, how much pressure we're putting on them, and the ability of, you know, simplifying the standards and simplifying this language, but also link it to the business performance. What's material? I'm going to go back to George's point about materiality. So what's important for the hairdresser, really? What's important for the pub? What's important for the plumber? So those are because ultimately their impact is on an aggregate term. So you really need to focus on maybe one thing that is the biggest impact. And I think where I'll close, because I think George is probably been an accountant or been in the world much better place than me than comments that. But I think that the accounting profession has, and the accounting bodies have a great role to play. One of the interesting learnings from the research we did was that SMEs really trust their accountants, and bookkeepers are critical to their business, and they're basically their most trusted advisors. As such, I'd expect that they'll put a lot on weight and trust in their advisory also in this space. And that's where we're partnering. And George, thank you for I think you've done a lot of the heavy lifting for me. We're partnering with Net Zero Accountancy Initiative, and we have launched just the other day Net Zero Now, with a view of supporting the profession, in supporting SMEs and enabling them to support SMEs onto this journey. Because as I said, SMEs don't want to become climate experts. They just want to understand what are the easy, simple steps that they need to take to have an impact. And they do want to have an impact. So it's really down to making this simple. And I'll throw in there just one other thing that Simon, I'm sure, will pick up on. It's not just crucial for SMEs and the global economy. If we want to, if we want the finance sector to transition a lot of their scope 3 will sit with SMEs. And I know from my time at Santander, one of our headaches was how do we measure scope 3, and how we also avoid that in the process of doing that, we create an excessive burden on SMEs in terms of disclosures. And ultimately, there's this tension, right? So financial institutions, banks need to disclose, but how much pressure they're put on the people they lend to disclose is a fine balance. We need to be careful that, because that there is a point which it becomes too much of a burden and we go to impact them negatively, which will ultimately result in not too much progress in the climate space.
Thanks, Elisa. Simon, do you want to pick that up?
Well, I'll pick that up, and also, if I may, Bill, I'll pick up one of the questions you'd asked me in advance, which talks precisely to this, which is, I thought it was a great question as well. How are banks going to take butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers on a low carbon journey? Because I mean, yeah, the reporting is important to see how sectors and countries and the world is making progress towards net zero. But ultimately, if SMEs spend all their time reporting, they're not going to be spending time, developing the new technologies we need, transitioning to low carbon business models that are high carbon now, and all these sorts of things. So while sort of accountants, I think I absolutely agree, have a really important role to play as trusted advisors to SMEs on some of these reporting issues. I think in terms of advising SMEs on their low carbon journeys, that's where banks need to up their game and become really trusted advisors. And, and for those of us in the banking sector, we know that, for the past 20 years, we've been talking about the importance of relationship managers and banks becoming trusted advisors to their SME clients. So for butchers, William, I mean, that journey to net zero comes with substantial transition risks, I would say, including, think of rising input costs, as the costs of meat production rise. Customers might be reducing their meat consumption as more of us become vegetarian or vegan. So this suggests maybe butchers need to look to reduce costs, might need to purchase more energy efficient equipment, for instance, perhaps also invest in new meat-free lines and alternatives as well. For bakers, energy costs will be very significant, keeping the ovens fired for 18 or 24 hours a day. So perhaps banks can help finance the purchase or lease of more energy efficient ovens, or for larger bakers, perhaps renewable generating capacity via solar or wind. And of course, to get all those butteries, croissants, loaves, and donuts to customers, perhaps we can help finance a fleet of electric delivery vehicles. Now, for candlestick makers, which I should point out isn't an area of great expertise for me, but as I understand it, candles are made with paraffin wax, which is petrochemical and not at all sustainable. So there's going to be very significant transition risks for your average candlestick maker, requiring probably a complete replacement of equipment, new raw materials to form candles from low carbon alternatives. I don't know what those low carbon alternatives are, so if anyone can enlighten me, if you excuse the pun, please do. So now for all three, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, then this is a transition that comes with these high upfront costs, new ovens, a fleet of electric vehicles, and so on. But this capital expenditure should be paid for by the longer term savings and operating costs from more energy efficient premises and machinery, from cheaper renewable energy, from a cheaper delivery fleet, all this kind of thing. And this is where banks come in, financing capital expenditure through lending or asset finance, with resulting savings covering the costs of that finance. And in fact, this is the model, this is the conceptual model that lies behind much, if not all, of green finance from a banking perspective. Whether it's a green bond to build a wind farm, a green loan to purchase electric vehicles, a green mortgage or a green retrofit mortgage, it's about sort of financing capital expenditure today to be paid back by lower operating and running costs. So some of this isn't actually too complicated. This isn't very complicated finance. We're just putting a green and sustainable wrap on all the things we do in finance for now. And that, I think, is the opportunity for banks and bankers to really support the SME sector and, in fact, the economy and the transition overall.
If I may add, William, because I think building on your point, Simon, and having done some of this work at Santander in my previous role, this is where I think education is really key. Because when I was talking, sorry to bring this really to life to my colleagues in the commercial bank, and the front line, really they didn't feel they had the confidence to have these conversations with our customers, which is some, I think, of the challenges and barriers that we are finding to really green finance, is that, how do we give the skills and confidence to colleagues and bankers in the front line to talk to customers about this? And I think that's where the work, Simon, that the Institute is doing is absolutely crucial.
Thanks very much. A completely different topic. What impact do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine will have on banks and investment managers' views on what they will finance? Are they therefore going to be more oil and gas activity in Britain as we seek a more secure source of supply in the short term? Maybe George first.
You mentioned the impact word, which Elisa brought up for the first time, and impact is one of the words which I think is on my white list of jargon words to be used, because I think it's very important. Essentially, we talk about sustainability a lot. Simon was speaking just now about the sort of impact that banks can have. I remember a great debate at Edinburgh University 2 years ago by the late, great Sir Roger Gifford, which was along the lines of bankers will save the world, which Sir Roger was very committed to the concept of. Walking along my little street in London the other day, I saw nestling amongst the Teslas, 3 builders' vans, all with green paint in them, and all with the word sustainable on the side. Now, these were builders who'd got some green paint and the word sustainable. And I think, how many of us wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to be sustainable today? But waking up in the morning and thinking, using the word that Elisa used and William, you just used, impact. What sort of impact can we make today, I think is very important. Now, coming back to my mantra about measurement, our overall mantra about measurement, very hard to measure impact. Neil Brand, the great chairman of our CISI Bond Forum, has done some great work with colleagues in recent years for us on measuring impact investing. But in terms of the impact that we can have as individuals, I think there's a great deal we can do. However, addressing your point about Russia, I think even before the invasion, there was a swing, a rather unfortunate swing from focus on climate to focus on energy. And this in part is an issue that Elisa raised about dynamic materiality, about what really matters. I think there was a danger even before the war that people would suddenly regard energy supplies and the maintenance thereof as being more important than the climate challenge. And it's certainly true that an awful lot of what's happened in recent months in the US, I mean, if you look at some of the new laws and government subsidies in the US, particularly around fracking and opening up nature reserves for new exploration licenses, a lot of these things we're going to be stuck with for decades and are a major retrograde step in terms of climate change. And I think this is a big issue. And I think, on dynamic materiality, coming back to that, there are many people out there, investors, who 3 or 4 months ago, I count myself in this, might have been slightly iffy about nuclear and will have changed views on nuclear power. Very iffy indeed about investing in guns, but guns become more important to us if we want to defend what we regard as being important. Therefore, perhaps investing in guns is no longer quite the bad thing it was in my head as it was a few months ago. William, I fear that the desire to protect energy streams will be a major issue in terms of the climate challenge in coming months. That said, I do think that the energy supplies from near neighbors are going to become an important geopolitical issue, and the ability to store and move energy around and the use of new technologies to do so will become very important indeed. We all know, and it's too short a program to talk about the importance of hydrogen and how it can be moved. I think we all know that there are massive shifts happening from technology. I'm a great fan of the concept that grey is the new green. We spent the first year of lockdown, certainly in Britain, watching on our television screens, on our wireless in the morning, and our newspapers, the scientists finding a solution to the virus through grey equipment, the engineers engineering the production of the vaccines with lots of grey equipment. So grey, I think, and that grey is the colour of the sort of metals that go into batteries and Teslas and so on and so forth, Grey could be the new green and could help us solve those problems. But alas, I'm usually an eternal optimist, but the war is causing severe challenges. And as Simon intimated earlier, very badly timed challenges to this achieving the right climate balance at this tipping point that we're definitely at right now. End of rant.
Thanks very much. Simon?
Well, just maybe two brief points, I think, to answer the question directly. In the short term, clearly we're going to see many countries make sort of rapid investments in securing their own energy security, and in the short term that may well lead to increases in fossil fuels in Scotland, North Sea reserves, such as those that are left exploiting the Cambo field, things like that. But on a longer term perspective, medium to longer term, this is probably good news in terms of accelerating the climate transition, because clearly fossil fuels, we can see, if we hadn't got it already, fossil fuels and the geopolitical nature and where fossil fuels are located, it is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for the planet, it's unsustainable politically, it's unsustainable economically for us. Wars are dreadful things. We're isolated from many of the direct impacts of the war in Ukraine at the moment. But one positive thing that tends to come out of wars is the acceleration of technological advancement in all sorts of areas. And I think this is one area that may advance much of the technology we need, or have already invented, but need to scale up in order to really dramatically accelerate the climate transition.
Thanks very much. We actually have some questions from our audience.
William, sorry,
yeah,
can I just add 2 points to your question, just very briefly? I agree with everything George and Simon said, almost everything. I would say, Simon, totally agree with the long term. I hope that this is a wake-up call, that dependence on fuel will create a dependence of people we don't want to depend on. So I hope it's a wake-up call that speed up the transition in the long term, but short term, yeah, it definitely will see some adverse effects. I would challenge George in terms of guns investment. I wonder, this is not a principle. I agree with you in terms of it's logical, and unfortunately, when you deal with bullies, there isn't much you can do. But I do wonder whether we should disinvest in guns and invest in women and diversity. Because I do continue to wonder whether the world will be led by women would have still so many wars. And I'm doing this also conscious that in the panel, I have the very hard task to represent the gender today.
Right, well, thanks very much. We've got 7 minutes left, so we have actually some questions from the audience. First one's from Helen Mackay, past chairman of the district centre. Saying, I totally agree that banks can help advise and guide SMEs. However, in a climate where banks appear to be reducing the number of relationship managers, this may be more difficult to execute. And I would certainly echo that in relation to my own bank, where basically it was a call centre. And Simon, do you want to sort of?
Agree, yes, because it's not every business needs a relationship manager, but many do. So yeah, I would like to see banks invest more in this area. But there's also just that sort of general knowledge transfer that's needed, whether it's from bankers, whether it's from accountants, whether it's from lawyers, from the whole kind of professional community, and making sure that information is shared as widely as possible. And I think also we have a duty not to put that behind kind of professional paywalls. It shouldn't be costing firms silly amounts in order to be able to speak with a climate specialist and things. But again, this comes back to capacity and capability building. We need to build capacity and capability, so green knowledge and skills right across the economy in all areas. It's not about just doing this in banking, doing it in accounting, even just doing it in the professions. It's absolutely across all areas of the economy. I think one thing that's still not broadly understood is that what we're talking about here is a whole economy transition that impacts almost every economic entity, almost every economic activity. It's that scale we are looking at here.
Thank you. Elisa, you wanting to come in on that?
Yeah, just to add, I think that we talked about relationship managers as an example, but the reality is we need to innovate and think about the new ways of sharing knowledge, which is not just through humans, but it's also through digital tools and means and all sorts of platforms. And I just wanted to mention we have at Sage a sustainability hub that is available and free for everyone. I think there's plenty of information, but we address specifically how SMEs can address these challenges. And I think the resources are, there are some useful resources out there, and I think education can also start there.
Yeah, thank you. One from Anthony Boyd. Should the imperative of green finance become mandatory?
I can start just with a comment, which is, I've been doing this on the field for over a decade, and I have seen my job has become much easier from when some of these requirements were made regulatory requirements, and it's sad to say that that's what it takes, and it's probably controversial, but that is the reality of it. I think, however, the risk in doing so is that you stop at compliance, whereas I think in this field we need leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree. Where are we? Next question up from Lorraine Dodd. How can professional bodies and businesses engage with local authorities on sustainable practices, production, and deal with barriers to improvement? Thinking, for example, around renewable energy needs and planning constraints.
I'm happy to come in very, very quickly, William. So again, this comes back to my capacity and capability point across the professions. I mean, this is a real issue. For people who want to retrofit premises or homes and then find they can't because the planning permissions don't allow them to. And yet, on the one hand, it's of a climate crisis. So actually, we need to make sure then that the chartered surveyors, that the professional planners, that local authority professionals in all areas and things, they understand the importance of the capacity and capability. It's not for us in the professions to kind of change local government. Of course, I would encourage everybody to exercise a democratic right and vote for the local governments they want to see as well. That may make change happen. But, in terms of the staff there, these regulations and things, that detailed work that needs to be done to kind of unlock the transition at all levels, it requires capacity and capability building with the local governments and the professions associated with them, just as much as it needs it in banking, finance, accounting, and so on. Thanks
very much, George.
William, I think we professionals can actually tell people, without in any way, of course, interfering with the democratic process, that doing things often costs money. In my little bit of London, there's a huge fight about low traffic neighborhoods, of which I'm a great supporter and a number of close friends are great attackers. And I think what people have got to understand is that if we want our climate to be better, if we want our children and grandchildren to be brought up in a better environment, then we've got to stop using cars for local journeys, for instance, unless it's necessary. And I think if you can explain to people that there's a cost to everything, and if the cost is, getting on your pins or on your bike for a short journey, and that will have a longer term we haven't even talked about externalities in this, but there are externalities in everything that we do. And a bit of explanation of basic economics, which I think professionals should be able to do, about the fact that things have got knock-on effects, could be very helpful. But local authorities, certainly from our members in investment and wealth management, is not a direct area for us or for them to be involved in.
Thanks very much. Elisa, any sort of final comments?
I'm conscious of time, so I'd say I just wrap up saying it all boils down to, I think, a concerted effort from all parties to deliver on this transition. Everything I've heard so far makes me think always to the fact that we won't solve this challenge alone. It won't be accountants, it won't be SMEs, it won't be banks, it won't be governments by themselves. It takes truly a concerted effort. Hence, conversations like this are important to see the interconnectivity. And I hope, George, this is not one of those jargon words, but I think it is one very important to highlight.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to the small number of attendees' questions we weren't able to get to. I'm sure we will be returning to this topic at some point in the very near future. But thank you to our speakers on your behalf. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, George, and thank you, Elisa.
Thank you for having us, William.
Thank you, William.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.